Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being so timely, and welcome to the public as well. On behalf of Commissioner Loizem and myself, Hannah Pingree, we are the co-chairs of the Maine Climate Council, and we welcome you to one of our quarterly meetings. We have a 2-hour-long agenda today, and it's somewhat action-packed with presentations. We have 3 different presentations. The first on the initial report of the equity subcommittee, which obviously we've been talking about for about a year, and we're very grateful to hear from the co-chairs about that and the next steps. We're going to hear about the transportation roadmap, the clean transportation roadmap, which is one of the first strategies recommended in the climate plan around how we advance the clean transportation strategies. We haven't talked a lot about coastal and marine in a little while, so we're going to hear from Commissioner Loizem and Commissioner Kelleher about the work of the 2 departments to advance some of the strategies in the coastal and marine sector. And then last but not least, we'll quickly look ahead to some of the work happening in the Maine legislature, some of the potential funding we are as a state government and across the state of Maine preparing for from the new federal infrastructure bill. And then we'll also think about our next meeting. So we have, again, a couple different presentations. It's presentation heavy, but a lot of great folks have been doing heavy lifting. So we are very grateful to hear from them today. Again, we're very grateful for the public who continues to join us in these meetings. So with that, I will first introduce the 2 co-chairs of the equity subcommittee. Gabrielle Alcalde and Ambassador Molly Dana have both done an incredible job with our facilitators and staff and the members of the equity subcommittee to really do heavy lifting over the course of the past year, kind of diving in to each of our climate council strategies, the work of the working groups, and thinking about how to add to ensure that equity is sort of our top consideration as we're thinking about implementation of climate council strategies, how to ensure that diverse communities, rural communities, people of Black, Indigenous populations are fully integrated into our climate plan. So again, we are very, very grateful for their hard work. Their hard work, as you'll hear about, is now going to go back to the working groups with their continued engagement. So I really want to just thank them both, and I will pass it off to them to really give you an overview. We'll take some questions, and then we'll go to clean transportation. So thank you, Gabriella and Ambassador Dana, and again, welcome. You're now welcome to present.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning. I'm Gabrielle Alcalde, and I'm honored to be co-chair of the Equity Subcommittee with Ambassador Molly and Dana. As Executive Director of the Sewell Foundation, our mission being to support the well-being of people, animals, and the environment while fostering equity and centering community voice, climate justice is critical to our work and our mission. Without active and meaningful participation from all sectors in climate justice, we simply cannot do what needs to be done. But also, as a mother, as an immigrant, and a woman of color, I know too well that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities have experienced the burdens and harms of climate change disproportionately at the local and the global level. There can be no climate justice without centering equity in everything we do. So the work of this subcommittee and the Climate Council is essential to me at a professional, personal, and frankly, at an existential level. With that, I'll pass it over to Molly.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Molly Dana. I'm the Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador and Climate Council member. And it's been really great to take part in this work. I joined the Climate Council as a tribal citizen and leader. And I knew that I wanted to bring some of that perspective to this work, and seeing the Maine Won't Wait plan, I think it's bold, I think it's needed. And I was very thankful to be able to dig in to that equity work that really needs to accompany that plan. And I am so happily not surprised, but just feel very thankful that I was able to learn from so many different perspectives when it comes to equity. So yeah, I guess for me, it was bringing my own perspective, learning from others, and laying the groundwork for all of this climate work as it moves forward. think, okay, next slide, Cassie. I just switched back and forth. Thank you. So before we get started with our presentation, we wanted to thank the members of our committee who participated in the meetings for the last year and contributed so much expertise and perspectives to this work. And we look forward to continuing to work together. We also want to thank our fabulous facilitator, Carol Martin, who has created so much space for mutual learning and understanding. And a special thanks to Sarah Kellerman and the University of Maine. A lot of you are familiar with her ongoing engagement. I also want to thank GoPIF. I know there's no space in the notes for that, but I really can't say enough about GoPIF and the Climate Council directors and how we have really elevated the voices of this subcommittee in this important work. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, I'm switching between screens. So here's a brief outline of our presentation. We'll start by reminding you about the Equity Subcommittee and our charge and offering some shared definitions of equity that guided the committee's work. We'll then provide a high-level summary of our recommendations and conclude with our process to move forward with the work this year. Next slide. Jumping right in. As you know, Maine Won't Wait established the Equity Subcommittee. So the members of this include representatives of diverse Maine communities, organizations, and industries, as well as members of the legislature. We were charged with setting equitable outcomes for Maine Won't Wait's climate strategies and with making recommendations to the Climate Council to realize our plan. Our goal was advancing equity and justice through climate action statewide, as well as monitoring this progress over time. We thought it would be helpful to start with some shared definitions, which we use to approach this work. Our shared definitions can be broken into three parts. We have understanding vulnerability, understanding frontline communities, and finally, understanding opportunities for equitable and just climate action. Next slide, please. Starting with vulnerability at the community level. We recognize that socially and demographically marginalized groups are often most exposed and most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. This map, which many of you have seen, is a ranking of vulnerability based on social and economic factors, including income, racial and ethnic categories, household composition and disability, and access to housing and transportation. So the communities in dark red on this map have a greater representation of marginalized communities than nearly 60% of other communities in Maine and are expected to be most challenged to prepare for and recover from climate-related hazards. And I'll turn it back over to my co-chair, Gabriella, for the next few slides, and you'll see me again for our recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly-Ann.
Yeah.
Across the state, different people experience different types and levels of vulnerability at different points in their lives, and that's an important context to remember. Because of this, the Equity Subcommittee took an inclusive approach to defining frontline and impacted communities. Communities in Maine might be low income or geographically isolated without easy access to goods and services to help respond to climate change. We know that Maine people who are representatives of Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities experience poverty at twice the rate of white Mainers. And we know that these populations in Maine, along with Maine's small business owners and workers, particularly in natural heritage industries like fishing, farming, and forestry, as well as aging people, new Mainer families, unhoused people, and people with disabilities, are experiencing the first and worst impacts of climate change. Next. So an equitable and just approach to climate action seeks to increase climate resources and resiliency in these and other communities who are most vulnerable to climate change. The Equity Subcommittee adopted an approach to equity which recognizes that equal distribution of climate resources is simply not enough. Simply put, equality is not the same as equity. Rather, an equitable approach to climate action provides increased resources to those communities that experience marginalization and other socioeconomic disadvantages and that bear disproportionate impact and burden of climate change first. By addressing the needs, opportunities, and challenges of those who are most affected by climate change, we know we can benefit all in Maine. Equitable action in climate has the goal of providing every Maine person and community the support that they need to overcome historic and continuing barriers to inclusion, decision-making, and stability. Building on this, a just approach to climate action provides climate benefits in ways that also address and remove the root causes of inequity in the first place. The systems approach helps ensure that all Maine people can benefit from our collective responses to a changing climate. Next slide. So given the subcommittee's understanding of vulnerability of frontline communities and climate equity and justice, we also recognize there are different types of equity that we wanted to talk about with you. These could be advanced through climate action in Maine. So the different types of equity are distributive, procedural, contextual, and corrective, and we provide a little bit of a definition here. By distributive equity, we mean that we recognize that disparities in the allocation of resources, health outcomes, inequities in living conditions, and barriers to political power place frontline or affected communities at greater risk. Distributive equity strategies then prioritize resources for climate action to the most vulnerable communities and populations first. Procedural equity is often referred to as equitable planning and implementation, meaning that communities have a meaningful opportunity to participate in decision-making, to have meaningful participation, provide input, and be able to affect policies and programs that directly affect them. So it's a matter of self-determination. Contextual equity ensures that mitigation and adaptation strategies take into account the reality of increased exposure and vulnerability of certain populations, such as low-income populations, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, among others. A contextual equity approach considers and takes into account the various socioeconomic conditions and existing injustices as critical dimensions in the design of community-based adaptation strategies. And finally, corrective equity asks that we recognize that we do not have fair or equal starting points, that there is an uneven playing field that has been created through decades and centuries of injustices, violence, exclusion, and extraction that have intentionally and disproportionately affected certain communities. Again, these communities are primarily Black, Indigenous, people of color, low-income, people with disabilities, and isolated communities. So a corrective equity approach seeks solutions that will not just advance climate goals, but will also contribute to righting historical and ongoing manifestations of social inequity. Next slide. With that shared understanding of that sort of contextual background piece, we're honored to present to you the initial recommendations of our subcommittee. We have been meeting since February 2021 to develop specific recommendations for all segments of the Climate Action Plan. We held a number of public conversations and meetings to revise and get input on our recommendations and adopted the recommendations by consensus at our meeting in January. We don't have time, nor do you probably want to walk through all 57 of the recommendations we developed, but over the course of the next few slides, we'll summarize the major themes of these recommendations. We do invite you to refer back to the report, which you received as part of your meeting packet with the invitation for this meeting for additional details. And now back over to Molly-Ann.
Thank you. So we'll get into the recommendations now. Here's the fun part. So our top level recommendations, I'll follow that with our clean transportation section. So across all these recommendations, our subcommittee identified 3 key themes. One, that recommendations should prioritize Maine's disadvantaged and frontline communities. Second, that our recommendations should ensure economic gains from climate change mitigation and adaptation flow to communities in need of support, and that we do not exacerbate inequality. And finally, we should create processes that support and allow for meaningful participation by members of Maine's disadvantaged and frontline communities. Getting into beyond these 3 themes, our committee identified a few cross-cutting recommendations that apply to strategies from all categories. These include fostering a sense of shared ownership of climate action across all Maine communities, increasing participatory opportunities for disadvantaged and underserved communities, decreasing capital barriers for low-income people to access clean energy and transportation technologies, and taking a comprehensive and holistic approach to assistance and wellness for all Maine people. Getting into strategy A, clean transportation. Our subcommittee believes that clean transportation programs can not only improve climate outcomes, they can also empower and improve the lives of community members in Maine. Our committee recommends that low-income residents should have access to targeted grants, rebates, and affordable and fair financing programs that allow them to have access to new and used electric vehicles, as well as convenient access to overnight charging, regardless of whether they own or rent their homes. School districts should prioritize the purchase of zero emissions transportation vehicles, especially in those districts with lower income households and with children more susceptible to asthma. The state should invest in better, low carbon public transportation. And we talked a lot about having safer places for active transportation, especially walking or biking. And this is particularly important, clearly, for people who cannot or choose not to drive. Next slide, please. This is a meaty one, so stay with me. So in this slide, we will look at our buildings sector recommendations and energy sector. Getting into the building sector, our energy subcommittee recognizes that housing and climate are inherently and inextricably linked. So how we live affects the climate, and the climate affects how and where we live. This is especially true in Maine, as heating, cooling, and lighting of buildings are responsible for almost 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. Individuals who live in older and inefficient homes are more likely to face health issues associated with their living situation and are more likely to face income barriers to some of these energy efficiency upgrades. In Maine, these populations are often low income, rural, and facing other climate-related challenges in daily life. So creating incentive structures and programs related to housing that specifically benefit disadvantaged populations can improve both health and energy outcomes, which was important to our group. In addition, more than 1/4 of Maine residents are renters, and renters often lack the ability to upgrade homes where they live. So with all of this background, we recommend that programs incentivize landlords to invest in clean building, heating, and renewable energy upgrades. The state should also ensure that when income eligible residents take advantage of clean building upgrades, energy bill assistance transfers seamlessly between energy sources. In addition, many Maine residents who are income eligible for bill assistance do not access it. So the state needs to work to ensure that everyone who needs assistance knows about it and can get it. And in order to effectively help disadvantaged communities access safe, affordable, and efficient housing, the state should conduct a comprehensive assessment of housing stock. That is buildings. Now into energy. So for the energy sector, our community believes that as the state embraces increasingly clean energy, that access to renewable power must be attainable for all Mainers. Policymakers should pay particular attention to engaging with low income and disadvantaged communities to ensure that all people have opportunities to participate in and benefit from this clean energy transition and the economic opportunity it presents. With new energy infrastructure is sited in rural or low income communities, our committee recommends that ensuring that host communities benefit from that new clean power. Benefits might include access to jobs, payments in the form of taxes, energy discounts, and other community identified goods and services. That was a theme across a lot of our work, was that community identified most of the, the things we were talking about. Additionally, our committee recommends that the process of siting new clean energy infrastructure meaningfully engage and account for impacts in disadvantaged and frontline communities. We also recommend various avenues to ensure that low and moderate income customers have the assistance and incentives they need for accessing clean energy. And that wraps up our energy recommendation. I'll turn it back over to Gabriella.
Thanks, Molly-Ann. So we're going to talk a little bit about clean energy and natural resource industries, as well as natural and working lands and waters. So in this area, our subcommittee recommends ensuring that the workforce opportunities associated with Maine's transition to clean energy are equitably distributed. Again, you'll hear that theme throughout our recommendations. The subcommittee makes a number of recommendations focused on ensuring that Maine's natural heritage industries, including farming and agriculture, fisheries and aquaculture, forestry and forest products, are supported by the state as they confront the impacts of climate change in their industries, and that they can remain economically viable as well as welcoming to a diverse workforce in the future. The subcommittee frames these recommendations under the framework and the idea of a just transition. A just transition refers to seeking just pathways to transition away from jobs and economies that pollute the air and the environment, and that instead strengthen the health and adaptive capacity of workers and uplift their entire communities. A just transition also means leaving no one behind, but in fact, centering and prioritizing those most affected. The recommendations represent the needs of those most affected by climate change. By committing to a just transition, benefits and burdens associated with climate change and resulting policy can be distributed equitably. One of the priorities of the subcommittee in considering Maine's natural and working lands is ensuring equitable access to the bountiful natural resources and places that Maine has, improving the lives and health of all people in Maine. Additionally, the subcommittee recommends that low-income and other disproportionately affected communities should receive preference in funding related to expanding or preserving natural areas, especially if currently they have less access to natural areas than more resourced communities. Finally, and importantly, the subcommittee recommends that the state's natural resource agency should continue to explore opportunities for rematriation, cooperative ownership, and management of lands with tribal nations. Next slide. The last three strategies from the Climate Action Plan were discussed in a single meeting of the Equity Subcommittee. So these recommendations contained within our report could often belong in any of these sections. The Equity Subcommittee recognizes that climate change impacts the health and safety of all people in Maine, including through exposure to extreme heat, drought, poor air quality, increased allergens, sea level rise, storms and flooding, food insecurity, among many other impacts. Due to both historic and current disempowerment and lack of access to resources, these health impacts will and have disproportionately affected frontline communities, since they are often both more exposed to and more sensitive to climate health risks. Limited capacity to respond to these health risks, for example, the inability to invest in air conditioning to escape the heat or have resources to rebuild after a disaster event, often exacerbate existing underlying problems and causes further harm to these communities. The Equity Subcommittee recommendations in this strategy are related to assessing and decreasing these vulnerabilities. For climate-ready infrastructure, the subcommittee recognizes that all Maine communities, regardless of their economic status, deserve climate-ready working infrastructure that will keep them safe and provide a secure foundation for health and economic success. Disadvantaged communities often lack financial capital and other resources to improve infrastructure, leading to negative outcomes after natural disasters and compounding the effects of systemic disinvestment. Our subcommittee believes that financial assistance programs, outreach, and preemptive support are particularly impactful and meaningful and necessary for helping these communities respond, adapt, and prepare for climate change. And we make a number of recommendations for helping communities identify vulnerable infrastructure, access funding for planning and engineering, and adopt programs and guidance to help citizens better understand climate risk. Next. Finally, meaningful engagement is a thread across the entire report. And as Molly-Ann said, the self-determination and participation and engagement of communities was something that came up at every one of our meetings. That was the basis for one of our top level recommendations as well. Additional recommendations from the subcommittee include supporting psychological resiliency to climate change, as we know there is significant psychological impact of climate change, especially in certain communities, engaging communities in resilience planning, and creating education and outreach materials that are culturally appropriate in multiple languages. Now, for now, this sums up our interim recommendations to the council, and we share these in gratitude for all the work of all committee members and all the work of the public who provided really wonderful and meaningful input and feedback throughout our process. We invite the council and its working groups to engage further with the report through an ongoing process, which I will now ask Jess to describe. We'll then have time for questions and comments, and thank you very much. Jess?
Thanks, Gabriella, and thanks, Ambassador Dana. Under your leadership, I think the subcommittee really had an excellent opportunity to do this work, and we really remain grateful to you as co-chairs and to the entire committee for this really robust body of work. So we have recommended a process moving forward, as Gabriella notes, to engage the council and the working groups and science and technical subcommittee. To select priority recommendations, we developed quite a number of recommendations which really align well with the initial work of the council and kind of take that work a step kind of in the direction of equity across all the types of equity that Gabriella and Ambassador Dana talked about. So first, to select some priority recommendations to focus on for near-term action, to identify metrics and goals to monitor the equitable implementation of the climate plan, and to identify partners or barriers for implementation of the priority recommendations that we select. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in a little bit more detail? What we're proposing is dividing the recommendations up across the working groups. Some recommendations, like the cross-cutting recommendations that we started with, will be considered by all working groups, but then sector-specific recommendations will really be considered by the relevant sectoral working group. In March, we will be providing a kickoff webinar for all of the Climate Council and working group members to level set on equity, to share information about equity metrics frameworks used nationally, and to suggest a process, kind of a clear process that working groups can follow to select those priority recommendations, to develop metrics, and if possible, to develop goals related to equitable outcomes for those priority recommendations. After this kickoff meeting in March, we envision that working groups will have 2 or 3 working sessions between April and September, so really over the course of the spring and summer, to review and to prioritize recommendations and develop potential metrics and goals. We'll propose that the equity subcommittee members work with each working group throughout this process, and we'll also offer facilitator and staff support to the working groups as needed. We're hopeful that these meetings will be supported with information generated by the working group members where possible and where practical. For example, if there's additional information, programs, or experience related to a particular recommendation, we would invite that as kind of baseline information for the working group to consider before picking priority recommendations to focus the rest of their work on. Ideally, at the end of this time, at the end of a couple of meetings of each working group will bring their priorities, their metrics, and the goals that they've developed back to the equity subcommittee. And the equity subcommittee will spend the latter portion of the year, kind of in that late fall, considering finalizing and presenting the priority recommendations and equity metrics to the Climate Council for adoption by the end of the year. That's our rough timeline and how we hope to see this work proceed. And I know this is a lot of information for us to offer at one time. Before I turn the floor back over to Hannah and we have some time for questions, I want to assure you that we'll be reaching out to each working group separately about the process and the support that we can provide, how we can be most supportive of your group moving forward. We want to ensure that this process leverages the unique expertise of each of your working groups in partnership with the expertise developed by the Equity Subcommittee, and that we can collectively advance a framework for ensuring equitable climate action moving forward. So with that, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your robust consideration of these initial equity recommendations, and I'll turn it back over to Hannah.
Great. Well, thank you, chairs, and thank you to Jess and to all of the equity subcommittee members, which includes members of the Climate Council, some of whom are now doing triple duties on the Climate Council in 2 different subcommittees. So again, I know this was a lot of heavy lifting. I think we've learned a lot about the process and how we'll do it for the next plan, but I think this is really meaningful piece of work and really now back in the hands of the working groups to think thoughtfully about how it applies to your particular area of expertise. So with that, questions or comments? I do just want to take this quick interlude. I didn't see him at the top, but I do want to welcome a new Climate Council member, Noel Bonham. He is the State Director of AARP Maine. He, as many of you remember, the former director of AARP was a member of the Climate Council, and we are very, very happy to have Noel here this morning. We added him to the council at the last meeting, and he was not able to attend. So welcome, Well, I don't know, you're not obligated to say anything, but we're very glad to see you here today.
I'm really honored to be here, Anna, and to join this council and to join this great work. And what a meeting to join with the recommendation from the Equity Subcommittee. I'm really excited and truly honored to be here. Thank you. Looking forward to the work. Great,
welcome. So questions or comments or next steps from any Climate Council members? There's some working group chairs here as well. Happy to hear any of your comments. If any of the other members of the Climate Council who are also on the Equity Subcommittee, welcome to hear your thoughts about next steps. You were so thoughtful and complete. There are no questions or comments.
We probably inundated you all with a lot of information. We refer you back to the text of the Equity Subcommittee's report.
And with that, I do see that Annie Fuchs from MEMA has a question. So Annie, go ahead.
It's not a question, just a comment this morning. I just wanted to jump in there and just say thanks for the rollout of all this information. From my standpoint, I consider it quite organized, and I'm ready for the next steps. I think things are quite clear, and that's just kudos to the presentation of information this morning. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I would again just remind everyone, Cassie put it in the chat for everyone. The full report is available online. It's available in the chat. We encourage folks to take a look at it if you haven't yet in the next couple of weeks as this work really continues to become something that we incorporate into all of the Climate Council's work. Any other comments? I'm not seeing any hands. Just unmute yourself if you want to just chime in otherwise.
Hannah, I'll just chime in that I just wanted to commend the authors, in particular, the definitions of equity, the distributive, corrective, frontline community, those are super helpful. And then the cross-cutting recommendations for all the working groups to consider, just really, really helpful, very, very thoughtful, lots of research, lots of places to go to dig in. So I just really want to say job well done. This is super helpful.
Great, thank you, Judy. Noel.
As someone who's just coming into this work, as like I should call myself a layman, this work seems very comprehensive and very clear, and I think that's very telling in terms of the amount of work that went in, and I'm really looking forward to how this is going to play out and being part of it.
Great, thank you. Ken.
Thanks, Hannah. I want to add kudos to the authors and the process by which this report was created. I think it's kind of as groundbreaking from a state perspective as the Maine Climate Council's efforts have been in general. So nice job there. Some things like the transfer of heating assistance from the current LIHEAP program, which really takes tax dollars and provides them to oil companies ultimately via low and middle income, and making that able to be a function in an electrified household, I think is groundbreaking. I've never seen that anywhere. So this is really well done. I think to some degree, recommendations in the report address how the working groups should proceed with their goals. And to some extent, they represent different goals for working groups. And I imagine navigating those that are different versus those that are how are what the committee will be addressing going forward, and Jessica's meetings with the working groups are designed to help. So I look forward to that process. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ken. And I think we do, obviously there are many different kinds of recommendations. We think all the working groups may take slightly different approach, how they gather more information and fully understand and take next steps. But I do think that's incredibly helpful, Ken, so thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I will just again add my significant thanks to our two co-chairs who did a lot of heavy lifting, and to all of the members of the subcommittee. Again, thank you for your extra time. Some of you, again, extra time on another effort. I think your engagement was incredibly helpful. And again, thank you to Carol, who I think is out there as an attendee, and Jess for their hard work staffing and facilitating. So with that, I will pass it. I don't see any more hands. I will pass it to my co-chair, Commissioner Loisem, for our next presentation.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Good morning, everybody. I think we've got some slides to pull up, and we'll talk about the transportation roadmap next. Great. So as you'll all remember, the majority of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector, and the majority of those emissions are from light-duty passenger vehicles. In the Climate Action Plan, this council recommended putting 219,000 light-duty electric vehicles on the road in Maine by 2030 to meet our 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction goal. This council also recommended that the state develop an EV roadmap to identify policies, programs, and regulatory changes needed to meet the state's EV and transportation emission reduction goals. In March of 2021, Governor Mills issued an executive order for development of a clean transportation roadmap to 2030 to identify how the recommendations of the council could be met. The roadmap was developed by the Cadmus Group with support from E2 Tech. This work was contracted by the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future in consultation with the Governor's Energy Office, Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, Efficiency Maine Trust, and with the input from a broad range of public and industry stakeholders. The roadmap reflects the recommendations of the Cadmus Group for options the state of Maine could pursue to reach the stated goals in the Climate Action Plan. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeff Morrison from the Cadmus Group to present the results of their analysis.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Morrison from Cadmus. I'm sharing my screen here. Thank you for the introduction, and I do have a number of slides. I'm going to go fairly quickly through them. Please pause me throughout if there are questions. Otherwise, I think we have 10 minutes at the end for other questions or comments. So this was the consultant team, as mentioned, Cadmus and E2 Tech. Cadmus leads a lot of clean transportation work, particularly in the Northeast US. This work was overseen by a steering committee from several different state agencies. We also had an advisory group that included industry, government, and nonprofit folks. And then we also solicited public input at various transportation working group meetings and through what we called listening sessions. So this is the agenda, and I'm gonna go fairly quick through the first half and then get to the recommendations, funding, and key takeaways as quickly as we can. On the origins, it's already been mentioned, Maine Won't Wait specifically calls for a clean transportation roadmap. So this roadmap we put together came out about a month and a half ago, and followed Maine Won't Wait. And also, as mentioned, transportation emissions are 54% of the state's emissions. The majority there are from the light duty trucks, passenger cars, about 60%. And then heavy duty aviation and other account for the rest of the emissions in the sector. And that other category includes things like marine, pipeline emissions, and a few other minor sources. So this is the Maine Clean Transportation Roadmap. I encourage you to go to GoPIF's website and download either the executive summary or the entire document. As stated, the purpose was to identify policies needed to meet the goals in Maine Won't Wait. So these are Cadmus's recommendations based on our own analysis and sort of best practices we're seeing in other states. If I had to describe it in a nutshell, it boils down to 16 new program recommendations for the state, and also has quite a bit of background for the general reader in terms of context of the specifically the electric vehicle market and sort of emerging trends in that market. But not to be forgotten, the roadmap does focus on vehicle miles traveled in one chapter specifically. And in that chapter, we really highlight some of the ongoing work at the state level and at the local level, agencies like GP-COG. So there's a lot of action in this area, and we have a pretty comprehensive list of what's going on in the state, if that's of interest. As I mentioned, we focus more of the roadmap on electric vehicles. If you're focused really on greenhouse gas reduction, that's where the emission reductions, the bulk of the emission reductions are expected to happen in the next 10 years or so. Obviously, there's a lot of other objectives that we should be looking at as well, besides greenhouse gas emissions, but because of the roadmap was really focused on the emissions question, electric vehicles is sort of front and center. So with that, just to call out a couple key trends at the national level in electric vehicles, and these are sort of good talking points if you're ever describing electric vehicles to other stakeholders in terms of what's going on right now. The costs continue to decline, in particular the battery costs, and a lot of drivers of EVs can actually be saving money on driving today. Not everyone yet. However, the upfront costs of an electric vehicle are expected to reach cost parity with gasoline vehicles sometime in the mid-2020s, mid to late 2020s, depending on your vehicle category. So the declining cost is a really sort of good story, because we're pretty certain that those cost declines will continue, and eventually, we'll go past the parity point, and people will actually be saving money on every mile they're driving. Another thing that's happening is consumer acceptance of electric vehicles is starting to shift. So this is from a recent large national survey from General Motors, where they found that 30% of vehicle buyers say that an EV will be their next vehicle, and 70% say they are open to buying an EV at some point. And these percentages are higher than they've been in the past. Another trend we're seeing, increasing EV manufacturing capacity. So I'll show in the next slide, but the automakers are really, really making the investments in EV manufacturing. That's steel that's going into the ground, and we know the vehicles are coming because these plants are being built. So there's sort of a certainty or a lock-in there, which helps us in our emissions planning. Another trend is greater vehicle availability. So to date, you've been pretty limited when you go to a dealership in terms of what vehicle makes and models you can buy. In the next couple of years, we're going to be seeing the electric pickups and just a greater diversity of SUVs, electric SUVs, which fit the average American driver a bit better. And then finally, should mention, there's been pretty major supply chain disruptions this past year. The vehicle market is severely constrained right now. It's worrying a lot of people. Prices are way up from where they were just a year ago. Most folks in the industry think that this is still a temporary supply shock, and that the prices should be normalizing here in sometime in a year or so. So we may continue to have some disruptions for a while, but you know, by the end of the year, most folks think we'll be closer to normal. Okay, I mentioned the automakers commitments. This is a kind of an eye chart, but just to emphasize that every major automaker now has made a commitment for a certain percentage of their vehicle sales in the future will be electric. So the tide is really shifting, and every year we're seeing more of these commitments. In terms of vehicle availability, Maine currently has 40 electric vehicle models available. California actually has the most out of any state at 65 models. And I mentioned the greater diversity is coming here in the next couple of years that really sort of fit the consumer preferences. These are two pretty central graphics, maybe the central graphics from the whole roadmap. And these on the left, we're looking at new registrations in Maine. So these are projections of electric vehicle registrations in Maine out to 2035 from a couple different scenarios. The one at the bottom there is from the annual energy outlook, and most folks sort of disregard that one as not realistic. The ones in the middle there are basically if Maine adopts the Advanced Clean Cars 2, you can expect to be somewhere between that blue and that orange line. And the point here is to demonstrate that the sales, the new registrations really are going to be ramping up, in particular at 2025 and after. The graph on the right just shows that basically the same set of lines, but now we're looking at vehicle stock over time. So you see that same kind of upward trend. And we know because of the way the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation is designed that there's quite a bit of certainty that we are going to be on one of those blue or orange trajectories. So with these projections, that enables us to do a lot more in the roadmap in terms of looking at how many chargers and what are the costs of those chargers. And so that's the sort of important sequence that we went through in the roadmap. So on the chargers, I just have two graphs. There's a lot more detail in the roadmap itself, but just to sort of level set, there's three major types of chargers. I think most everyone knows this. They range from very low power to really long charge times to very fast power, so DC fast chargers. And right now, the fastest fast chargers for a light duty vehicle would be about 350 kilowatts, which means you can recharge you know, a 250 mile electric vehicle in something like 15, 20 minutes. The goal of, you know, placing the charging is really to match the dwell time of the vehicles at that parking location. So if you're on a corridor, you want faster charging. If you're in a lot that primarily cars sit for 8 or 12 hours at a time, then you want a slow power. The reason is that there's a huge difference in costs here. So if we're optimizing on costs, you want to match that dwell time. These are two graphs from Efficiency Maine Trust's strategic plan on the left, showing the current charging stations or the soon to come charging stations in the state. And then on the right shows sort of the strategic areas of deployment over the next couple of years. Okay, so in terms of recommendations, these are a little difficult to list in a non-boring way. So here's a big list. These are recommendations around electric vehicle programs for the state. I mentioned that Advanced Clean Cars 2 at the top already. There's a corollary program somewhat similar that's Advanced Clean Trucks. That's both of those are very critical to get into place if Maine wants to continue expanding its electric vehicle market as aggressively as possible. The next few focus on charging. So public fast chargers are very important. Multi-unit dwellings, level 2 charging program is a recommendation. And then an expanded low-income EV incentive program, which I'll talk about in a second, with a level 2 charger. And then a couple other programs there at the bottom that you can read. For public and active transportation, I mentioned this was a little less of a focus of the roadmap. We do have these 3 recommendations as sort of new programs, but I mentioned, you know, DOT and the local planning agencies are already doing a lot in this space. And then finally, utility programs and efficiency Maine trust programs. These are mostly to help with the sort of economics of charging and make charging more conducive for both the installation and operation. And I'm happy to talk more about these. Out of the roadmap, we also had a long list here of sort of future research that we realized was needed, or just knowledge gaps. So I won't go through all of these, but you know, that first one, my understanding is already starting. Joyce is already starting to look at that, and there's a lot of other areas of need in the state. So we mapped those out. Okay, so on the funding piece, let's see. So we tried to take stock of sort of what the current state funding was for charging. You know, charging is expected to be a pretty large cost in the future. So, so these are all the sources that are sort of known today. They're not all of them. You know, the state obviously doesn't have the second bullet. There is the federal bipartisan infrastructure funding, 19 million there. There's a number of competitive grants in the federal infrastructure bill, and then down at the bottom, some potential additional money from the New England Clean Energy Connect. So basically, we looked at all these funding streams. We said, okay, here's what we know exists or will soon exist, and then looking at those EV projections into the future, like I said, allows us to come up with a ballpark number of chargers in the state. And so you put that together and you get this graph here, which shows the basically the total investment cost for charging, public in gray and residential charging in orange, that's needed in the future based on our sort of best guess. So these are total dollar values for investment, and then we know the dollars that are existing or soon to be coming for charging, and then that allows us to assess, you know, what is that gap. And there is a gap, particularly you know, as we get out 2024, 2025, and the number of EVs gets larger, so the number of chargers needed gets larger. So that's a prominent feature in the roadmap. Now, this is, I apologize, there's so much going on this. This is a sort of a very basic program design for our extended low-income EV incentive program. So the Efficiency Maine already has a kind of an income qualified EV incentive program. This new proposed program would try to basically match EV sales closer to the distribution of income of normal new car buyers and used car buyers in the state. So basically this graphic here is showing, you know, where do the new EV buyers come from in terms of their income distribution. That's that first line. Where do the new car, like all new car buyers, not just EVs, but all new car buyers come from in terms of income. And then finally, that lower bar is where do the used car buyers come from in terms of income. And so this this program design here we have in the roadmap suggests a set of incentives that would match the new EV buyers would match that all new car buyers, if that makes sense. And then we sort of cost that out at a pretty high level. So just one last slide here on key takeaways. You know, there's a lot in this roadmap, but if you boiled it down to just a couple really, really important things to stress, advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean truck regulations really are transformative in their scope and create this long-term market signal that that will attract investment and advertising and a lot of other sort of correlated benefits. The second one is demand charge mitigation. As I mentioned, fast chargers are really expensive and there's not a great reason to build them right now if there's no public incentive. And so we talk about those economics and that need there for public funding for fast chargers. We also talk about policies to reduce vehicle miles traveled, like I mentioned, and a few recommendations there. And then finally on the funding piece, you know, like I said, we cost out a few kind of critical things, the charging and that low EV incentive, low income EV incentive program, the expansion of the program. And we find that we might be okay for a year or two, given the current funding streams, but that you know, more is needed and there should be some opportunity to aggressively compete for federal funding here. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I know we've got Hannah, Michael, and Jess on the line too, and Joyce, and I think some other folks too for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really helpful. I think you all did a fantastic analysis, and the metrics that you've provided, dollars and cents, really helps with some policy-making considerations for this council and others. I see we have a question from Representative Thorne.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Morrison, I'm curious, as I'm watching your presentation, what is the anticipated difference in revenue, if any, for the state per vehicle converted from, I don't know if you refer to a gas vehicle as a GV and an electric vehicle as an EV, but I know that, you know, for every gallon of gas, the state makes a certain amount. And I'm not sure if I didn't hear it or didn't see it, but how much a consumer will be charged per kilowatt or electricity, what the cost will be, and what the difference may be in revenue for the state for every gas vehicle converted to an electric vehicle.
I will maybe, Jeff, I mean, you're welcome to answer that because I know that many states are sort of contemplating that. I mean, I think Representative Thorne, you're asking sort of a fundamental policy question about the ongoing funding of our transportation system, which I think is certainly something that, you know, Maine still has about 6,000 EVs or plug-in hybrid vehicles on the road. Obviously, as that number gets greater, then the funding of our transportation infrastructure is a question. And I know that, I don't know if she's out there, but I would actually maybe push that question also to Joyce, because I know the Department of Transportation is thinking thoughtfully about that very question. We've certainly see other states and countries around the world who are ahead of us thinking thoughtfully about it. So I don't know, Joyce, if you want to sort of think it's really the approach of the Maine DOT to the ongoing funding of our transportation system, which is really I think this is your fundamental question.
Yeah, and I thank you, Representative Thorne. I'm Joyce Taylor. I'm the Chief Engineer of Maine DOT, and Commissioner Van Note is on another call at this moment, but anyone who knows him knows he's all about money for the transportation system, and it is something that we're looking at. I think, to Hannah's point, there haven't been enough EVs on the road right now that we felt that the issue needed to be solved today. I think in part, this is a national issue that has to be solved nationally, not just state by state. And the one thing that I always say is electric vehicles need safe roads and bridges too. So it's not an either or, it's not an environmental versus transportation, they're combined, right? So we're gonna have to solve this problem together because those EVs are gonna be using the transportation system as well. So I don't have much of an answer, but I can tell you we're putting some thought into it.
I'm just curious if there's an average light vehicle an average revenue generated per vehicle. You know, some people drive more, some people are salesmen, some people only drive to church on Sundays. I understand that, but an average gas consumption and then the tax associated with that equates to a revenue for Maine. And I don't know what the charge will be for charging a vehicle. Will if I have an electric vehicle and I plug into a charger, am I assessed a cost? And is there a portion of that cost that goes to the state for transportation related issues?
Not yet, not at this time. I think we have participated with it used to be the I-95 corridor where we did a trial on measuring miles where you would be taxed on the number of miles you drove. And one of the things that came out of that is, well, it might work for us because we only have one border state. You know, states like Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, where you could be in and out of each state, it was really hard to figure out who got those taxes, which is partly why I say, to a certain extent, I think this is going to have to be a national solution because, think about all those tourism, right? All those people who have EVs
have gas
now.
vehicles.
Yeah, or
and then switch to electric.
Yeah,
and then come up and Maine gets no revenue from that.
Right. So yeah,
there's going to be an obvious large shortfall of revenue that the state's going to have to go elsewhere to recoup. So I just wondering if anybody had put a number on that per vehicle, you know, saying an average income from gas tax per year on a vehicle that converts to electric, what that drop is or difference.
We haven't done that, but I think it could be done. We've got a lot of numbers about average age of vehicles and miles driven, that kind of thing, but we haven't gone there yet, at least at Maine DOT.
Okay, thank you.
Ken?
Thank you. Comment and two questions, Jeff. The comment is just a frame of reference for folks on the call. Jeff mentioned how expensive DC fast chargers are. The kilowatts used by, say, an average residential home are, say, 7 or 8 to 10 or 12 kilowatts. So when you're looking at a 50 kilowatt to 350 kilowatt DC fast charger, you're looking at, say, 5 to 50 homes. So if you were thinking about a development of 50 homes, yeah, there's some electrical load associated with that and some infrastructure investment. No wonder there's that associated with the electrical infrastructure investment associated with a large DC fast charger. Jeff, the questions are, you mentioned a loan loss reserve. That kind of harkens back to the old days of the only way to serve low income is through loans, but that's kind of oxymoronic because loans have credit checks and low incomes are more apt to fail credit checks. Tariffed on-bill financing prevents that. And I wonder if you looked at that sort of on-bill financing as well in your analysis and have any recommendations. My other question is, given that the grid of the future as renewables are more and more of our generation supply and they're variable, instead of managing the grid by managing the supply side, we'll have to manage our demand. And EVs will be a critical element of managing demand. Did you look at any revenue streams associated with the demand side revenues from EVs to offset some of these costs or contribute to them? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Again, to quickly on the second question on the, I guess, managed charging and revenue from the grid. We did not specifically look at that. It's a pretty complex thing to model, as you probably know. So that was outside of the scope of this study, but it certainly is it's an important piece, and there's kind of new research every day on that. There was a big paper that was just published from the DOE on that topic, if you'd like to see that. On the loan loss program, I would point you to Jonathan Rubin's white paper that was written last year. We didn't look in great depth at that either, but he did. And so there's a lot more there, and I think that's publicly available.
If I could just step in, Jeff, Maine DOT actually consulted with Jonathan Rubin and asked him to look at equity in terms of electric vehicles and that subject. And one of the things we asked him to do was to find best practices around the country. California is running a loan loss program. And in this case, they're specifically working with people who cannot get a credit report, and they are doing some things. Really, it's a lot of financial advising and helping people be able to either get credit or to get a guaranteed loan. So I'm happy to share that paper with you. It's actually a really interesting model.
Are there any other questions or comments? Hannah?
Melanie, just sort of this is a maybe unfair question of Jeff. I think obviously it's helpful to see the graphs, and sort of shows the challenges are partially about the supply and the number of electric vehicles we can get to Maine, regardless of whether, I think as people want to buy them, even finding one now is a challenge, but clearly we see the supply increasing in the future. Can you give us just maybe the very couple sentence overview of the way of federal policy and the kinds of investments the federal government is making now, and the kinds of decisions they might make that certainly help states like Maine and lots of other states around the country who are looking at similar and aggressive goals? So sort of, not dissimilar from the last question about how do we even fund our transportation systems, what are the sort of federal policy levers that will actually help states like Maine be successful?
Are you talking, Hannah, in terms of the federal infrastructure bill or other programs?
I think both, sort of in summary, just kind of the importance of some engagement at the federal level, some of which maybe they've made those decisions already, some of which they're still debating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think well, I guess the infrastructure bill, first of all, the frame of reference I have is the VW settlement a few years ago was there was specifically $2.1 billion in that for Electrify America to build its charging network, and then up to about 15% of the rest, the 12 billion other money that was for EV charging. So in total, that VW settlement was about a third of the size of this federal bill's 7.5 billion. So if you want a frame of reference, they've gone up. The federal government has multiplied that by 3, and that's in terms of that's how I'm thinking about the money and the charging that you'll start to see. So it's like some funding, but it's not a huge, it's not a total game changer. And I think on the vehicle side, there's a lot more that's needed. The current federal EV tax credit is going to be expiring for a lot of automakers, or already has. And so that's the thing that could be a game changer if the federal government goes forward with the Build Back Better bill. So I think that's how I would summarize it right now, is that there needs to be more emphasis on the vehicle side here, and that the charging is okay for a short period, but there needs to be more here.
Any other thoughts or questions out there about the transportation roadmap? Just a reminder that the link to the roadmap is in the chat. If you're interested, it's available online. So I guess with that, we'll move on to our coastal and marine topic if there aren't any other questions for Jeff. All right, well, thank you so much, Jeff, for your presentation, and to the Cadmus Group and E2 Tech and the folks who all worked on putting that together, and for your presentation this morning. Got still a lot of work ahead of us in terms of meeting our goals, so thank you for helping us get there. So next up is Commissioner Kelleher and I. As Hannah mentioned earlier, we're trying to focus particularly on updates around certain topics for this group at our quarterly meetings, and we thought that it had been a while since we'd covered some of the work that's happening around the coastal and marine area. So Commissioner Kelleher will give you some updates on work that's happening involving Department of Marine Resources, and then I'll give you some updates regarding DEP. Take it away, Pat.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm going to take a little bit of a shotgun approach here. There's a lot to cover from DMR standpoint. We've been engaged in a lot of work around climate change. Let's see, this is my 10th year as commissioner, and I don't think there has been a time in that 10 years where we have not been dealing with the challenge of warming waters. In some cases, they are negatives. In the case of lobster, they've been a positive. But I'll touch on the negatives that are starting there as well. So we can go right to the next slide. You're all probably aware that the Maine Coastal Program has been moved to the Department of Marine Resources. This is a critical program within the agency, and it's certainly well positioned to focus on climate initiatives. Some of the work being done right now are the protection of natural lands and waters. The Maine Coastal Program has funded 11 projects in 11 coastal towns, including design engineering of climate resilient working waterfronts. Our working waterfront is at attack really from two prongs. One is the threat to development, but the other is the issues facing sea level rise. So this is a critical program to help address those needs. And then reducing our climate footprint using natural carbon storage. A lot of talk about the blue carbon initiatives within the Climate Council. We believe this holds promise to reduce our carbon footprint. And so there's a lot of work that will continue with the focus on blue carbon. Next slide. Next slide, please. Also understanding climate impacts on marine habitats. We have a very aggressive mapping initiative within the coastal program, dealing with the bathymetry and bottom habitats in both near and offshore. Extremely detailed. These are all publicly available maps that will help DMR track species assemblage over time. And then the coastal program is also measuring the change in salt marsh elevation to see how sea level rise is affecting their health. In addition to the blue carbon, salt marshes offer the multiple ecological benefits, including juvenile fish habitat. And lastly, within the coastal program is using nature to restore and improve habitats. This is one of the ones that I get most excited about. The program continues to develop a toolbox to help towns and road owners restore tidal flow to coastal streams, improving ecosystem health. And it's all focused on connectivity of habitat for anadromous fish being key. And then they've completed 3 projects to study how oyster shells, fallen trees, and plants can combat bluff erosion, improve sand supply to healthy clam flats. This was an initiative that I started dealing with 20 years ago within the Salmon Commission. Maybe I'm getting old, Hannah. Is that what you was laughing about? About 20 years ago, dealing with large woody debris in streams to help improve in-river habitats. And this is the same type of approach that we're taking further downstream now. Next slide. So moving on to the Bureau of Marine Science, these next two slides have a lot of information. I'm not going to go over everyone in detail, but just to highlight a few things going on within the Bureau of Marine Science. We've supported the offshore wind siting characterizations, working with the Governor's Energy Office. That's been a very intensive ongoing work with the industry. You're all probably well aware of the concerns that have been brought forward by the commercial fishing industry as it relates to offshore wind and any associated route that a cable might take. So the mapping work that the coastal program does, and then the work that we do from a fishery standpoint, is to help figure out and understand what the impacts are and how to help with siting. I think actually this afternoon I'll be giving final approval to some research. We were supplied $2 million through the budget last year to initiate some work around habitat within the Gulf of Maine. So that's a continued ongoing work here for us. And then publishing temperature impacts on lobster maturity over 3 decades. So as we've had warming waters in the Gulf of Maine, what we've seen is an expansion of habitat for settlement for lobster. And you can see that in our landings. Over the last decade, we've gone from 30 to 40 to 50 million to upwards of 120 million pounds of lobster landed. We're down back closer to 100 million pounds of lobster landed. Very high value this last year. But now we are actually seeing the negative impacts when it comes to lobster. And the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission, because of the climate impacts, has initiated a resiliency addendum for lobster, and hope to have that finalized within the next year. One of the other things, just at the very bottom of the slide, we've always had white sharks in the state of Maine. We've had detections of white sharks and reports of white sharks for the last 50 to 75 years that I'm aware of, as far as what's been detected. We had a tragic event in the state of Maine a few years ago where a woman from New York swimming in the mid-coast was attacked and killed by a white shark. So we, working with the legislature, secured funding to do some additional work. We believe that as we're starting to see expansions of bait stocks, in particular in Menhaden, which could be driven by warming waters, we're starting to see many more white sharks being detected. And we detected with our acoustic array 27 individual white sharks that were tagged off Massachusetts over the last few years. Next slide. Also within the Bureau of Marine Science is an award that we received from Maine Sea Grant, the National Sea Grant, for the lobster work that we're doing. A lot of the work that we're doing and that we need to focus on is on the assessment side of the business, so we have a better understanding, in particular with lobster, not only what warming waters are doing negatively, but also ocean acidification. So that work is continually ongoing. And then you probably can't turn a television on without seeing me with a camera stuck in my face talking about right whales. So right whales are certainly in the press, and they're in the press more and more because of the shift in distribution patterns, and it's directly linked to warming waters within the Gulf of Maine. We have large feeding congregations to the south in Cape Cod Bay and south of Nantucket. And then those whales now move around, through and around the Gulf of Maine because of the lack of food availability. So we don't have those feeding congregations anymore. We are now working with acoustical traps to give a better understanding of what areas and how they're being used within the Gulf of Maine to help alleviate impacts to the commercial industry. Next slide. So for the Bureau of Marine Science, just quickly, the 2022 outlook, we have created, because of the emphasis and renewed emphasis on climate, we've created a new division of ecology and environment within the Bureau of Marine Science. The emphasis is on scientific studies to support our work on right whales and within the lobster fishery. We're initiating pre-construction monitoring and proposal for new research array for fisheries resources in the physical environment. And then, as I mentioned earlier, implementing an additional shark monitoring network. That actually is driven also by certainly public safety issues as well. And then we're reviewing DMR's monitoring programs with respect to climate change. We're evaluating the ability of our current programs to detect climate-related changes and the frequency and the intensity of the sampling. So this is a theme that you'll see when I discuss public health as well. Next slide. And speaking of public health, the Bureau is addressing two very specific areas as they relate to bivalve shellfish and public health. And that's the changes in occurrence and distribution and abundance of harmful algae driven by warming waters. And also driven by warming waters is the increased presence of Vibrio bacteria resulting in illness. And Vibrio can result in incredibly serious illness, including death. I'm incredibly proud of the work our Bureau of Public Health does to keep shellfish industry certainly thriving, but also protecting public health at the same time. There's very seldom do we ever see an illness associated with bivalve shellfish. And then from a resource management standpoint, changes in species presence and abundance, impacts of increased predation by native and non-native species, and the effect of acidification and low dissolved oxygen and other environmental impacts. Next slide. We're also increasing monitoring to developing new testing methods. We've been a leader in the shellfish industry, both on the east and west coast in this area, and also initiating Vibrio monitoring programs, again, identifying high-risk areas of development of risk management. And as we identify these areas, we can quickly move them into rulemaking to ensure expansion of public health and safety. And we're also initiating intertidal sentinel monitoring sites now to assess the long-term changes, both sea level and warming waters. This provides an early warning to the presence of new invasive species and habitat shifts. So this is a new program within our Bureau of Public Health. Next slide. Bureau of Sea Run Fisheries actually, I started the Bureau of Sea Run Fisheries when the Salmon Commission was combined with the Department of Marine Resources. It became a division, and we've actually elevated it because of the importance of our anadromous fish species, but also because of the issues related to climate change. Stream flows are changing, temperatures are warming, sea level is rising. All of those things have very negative impacts to our coastal streams. And so the Bureau has a new focus and a revised focus on addressing these issues. Next slide. Some of the things that we're focused on within the Bureau of Sea Run Fisheries is upgrading infrastructure, replacing undersized culverts, bridges. As you can see, there's a little bit of overlap with what's going on within the coastal program, and that's a good thing. I think the coastal program and this Bureau are working very well together to identify these particular issues and, as importantly, identifying funding. There is a lot of money within the federal government, within the budgets that have just passed. So we're focused on trying to leverage those funds. I know the Nature Conservancy has certainly done a really good job at bringing people together, starting to prioritize the work that needs to be done ongoing. And it's imperative that that prioritization work gets done sooner rather than later. Also continued focus on restoring impaired habitat, restoring stream beds and stream banks to their natural state. That's some of that large woodwork that I spoke about earlier. That stabilization is critical to ensuring that the habitat remains usable for all the different species that are coming up and down our coastal streams and up to the ponds. And then removing small dams to reduce warming aspects to streams. These small dams create impoundments. Those impoundments become heat sinks. And then that certainly creates a shift in habitat and what species might want to utilize those habitats. We're continuing to identify the priorities also for land conservation that are critical to protecting key areas and riverine habitats. And then identifying and recommending the riparian buffers. And here, working with our partners, we're certainly supplying our partners with information as it relates to funding possibilities for land conservation. Wearing my other hat from chairing Lands for Maine's Future, it becomes a very good partnership with those out there that are focused on those areas. And then managing for resiliency. I think that's a theme across the Department of Marine Resources is managing for resiliency and ensuring that we can stabilize what we have to make it through these warming periods. Managing our resources to increase populations and restore populations has always been critical, but more and more we're starting to see these stressors for our native fish, and also seeing the expansion of fish species from the mid-Atlantic that are now moving up our coast and wanting to utilize the habitat and creating competition for native species. Next slide. And lastly, I just want to very quickly touch on the Lands for Maine's Futures program, in particular the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program. That program resides within the Department of Marine Resources, and obviously the funding mechanism comes from the Lands for Maine's Future. So we have a committee that when RFPs go out, the committees are grading and judging these particular projects as they come in, and then we advance them to the board for funding. New this year through the scoring requirements is sea level rise. So we are recognizing that making an investment in a particular working waterfront, knowing that it could be susceptible to sea level rise, we want to know that up front. The good thing about the working waterfront is that what we're seeing is the money, we're buying something, and I think people always need to remember that we're buying a covenant. So we're not directing them on how to use that money, but what I have been really appreciative of seeing with the money that is received by the owners of the property is that they are investing back into those properties, and in many cases investing back in the property to create resilience around sea level rise. So that is a renewed focus within the LMF Working Waterfront Program. And with that, I'll stop talking because I probably burned through my 10 minutes, but Hannah and Melanie didn't give me the hook, so I'm feeling good there. So yeah, answer any questions or however you want to handle it. Softball questions, please. I don't have a bunch of experts standing behind me helping answer the questions. So.
Do we want to go ahead and do any questions for Pat, or I could go ahead and we could save them to the end?
That works too.
I don't see any hands immediately popping up. All right, we'll keep going.
That's it, I'm done.
No, you're not. Pat, you're not leaving, are you?
No, I'll stay right here to back you up.
All right, good, thank you. All right, so as some of you know, we're really excited that LD 593 got approved last year to finally provide sustainable funding for seagrass and now salt marsh vegetation mapping along the entirety of Maine's coast. We've been doing this for years, pulling funding together, bits and pieces, grants, partnerships. It's critical to have this resource be mapped. It enables us to calculate blue carbon contributions. It's important for project developments along our coastline. And the data has been sparse in some cases or entirely lacking. And now we'll finally have a system of having the entirety of the coastline mapped every 5 years. So thanks to everybody who is involved in supporting that and making that happen. I think we're all going to benefit from the data we'll be generating from that. Next slide. So as Pat mentioned, we're working with the Maine Coastal Program involved in mapping, as well as the Natural Areas Program at Department of Agriculture. Our work's coordinated with the Maine Geolibrary Board, with NOAA, and with the Nature Conservancy, with the overall objective being to make sure that the information we're gathering is publicly available, that it's in a format and a platform that's accessible for everyone who wants to be able to make use of it. And so this is the kind of work that we talked about when this council started, is the outcomes we can get from collaboration and from sharing our information to achieve larger goals together. Next slide. So we won't be able to accomplish everything with the money that's been allocated, everything that we would hope to do, but we can definitely get started. We will have, at a minimum, seagrass and salt marsh vegetation extent 5% cover. And we're going to be continuing to work with our partners and exploring federal funding opportunities to add to the information to have intertidal seaweed maps, finer scale bathymetry, and even speciation of vegetation. We do expect that the every 5-year mapping will enable us to see changes in these resources over time, will significantly contribute to our coastal carbon inventory, and will help a lot with siting of new aquaculture facilities. But additional information will be helpful also for sea level rise impact analysis, restoration planning, establishing sentinel sites, and hopefully at some point also more comprehensive rockweed inventory. Next slide. There are 2 groups that I wanted to mention that are working on gathering information and helping develop blue carbon inventory. The Maine Coastal Carbon Group, also, I guess, calling themselves the Maine Blue Carbon Network, being co-led by Bates College and Maine Coast Heritage Trust. They're in the process of formulating a mission statement, establishing their goals and an agenda for the work they'll be doing this year. They're planning to take a lead role in continuing and increasing communications about blue carbon research advances, promoting that research, and providing technical expertise on blue carbon topics. The Blue Carbon Network is working collaboratively with DEP to gather the best possible information for the 2023 emissions and sequestration inventory, where we hope to include an inventory of salt marsh, seagrass, and macroalgal resources. There's a national model that could aid with these calculations for coastal marshes, but the Blue Carbon Network hopes to holistically assess carbon storage occurring in Maine by tailoring that existing model and then adding data for seagrass and macroalgae. There's also a New England Coastal Carbon Group being led by EPA Region 1, with many partners in the group contributing information on seagrass distribution, salt marsh distribution, carbon density information from soil cores, and vegetation classifications. The goal of this group is to assemble a coastal carbon inventory for New England, and maps of the carbon storage in the various habitat types will be available on the Northeast Ocean Data Portal, which the link is provided for here on the slide. Next slide. So while we're preparing for all of this work, as I mentioned, pulling little bits and pieces together, we did do a lot of mapping along the southern coastline of Maine in the last couple of years. We are anticipating releasing the 2021 low tide imagery and seagrass GIS layers. So that would cover from Elliott to Cape Elizabeth. And then this summer, there's ongoing seagrass mapping happening from Cape Elizabeth to Phippsburg. And then concurrent with the seagrass and salt marsh vegetation mapping that's happening, there will also be estuary water quality and biological community characterizations occurring. So while we've got people deployed in those locations gathering the mapping data, they'll also be taking samples and collecting other information as well. And also just wanted to note that down around Portland, we've been working with Teams Ostera. They've been engaged in seagrass monitoring around the Portland area. And so this is, I believe, an image of them diving in that area to collect that information. So again, great example of the kind of partnerships that we can form and the information we can gather together. Next slide. So switching topics a bit to sea level rise, you'll probably remember that last year LD 1572 was the resolve directing us to analyze the impact of sea level rise and report back to the ENR committee any recommendations for statutory changes that are needed to incorporate sea level rise predictions into the decision making of our agencies. And the predictions that were identified were those provided by the Science and Technical Subcommittee of 1.5 feet by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100. So the report back to the legislature is available on DEP's website, and in it, for most of the agencies, we identified that there weren't statutory changes that were necessary. There are lots of regulatory and policy adjustments that can be made and have been happening to incorporate consideration of sea level rise. But for DEP and for Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, we did identify a set of specific changes, and the Environment and Natural Resources Committee will be reporting out a bill containing that proposed language from the report, and we'll be conducting a hearing at some point this spring. So look forward to that, and please, feel free to submit comments and participate in that process. For the Department of Environmental Protection, we are proposing a change to the harmonious fit standard in site law to include sea level rise as a consideration. So that could be pretty significant for some projects that are considered, particularly along our rivers and our coastline. It also includes a suite of changes recommended by DACF to support municipal and regional planning. And I'm glad Judy's on the line today, because if there's any questions about that, be happy to send them her way. Also wanted to flag LD 1809 that has been voted out of the ENR committee already, to allow exemptions to height limitations in the Shoreline Zoning Act. This is because we found a conflict between flood requirements, flood zone requirements, and the restrictions in the Shoreline Zoning Act, where a building cannot be raised and have its overall height become too high. And so this was a way to try to find a happy medium to allow those buildings to be raised up when they're in a floodplain and need to have that additional elevation. Lastly, just wanted to note that DEP is also planning to do a suite of rule changes over the course of the next several years. Those were also discussed in the report back. One of the ones we'll be focusing on first is Chapter 500 for stormwater. That will help us to address not only issues with inundation along the coastlines and our rivers, but also to consider increased storm flows that we know we need to be planning for in our upland areas as well. Next slide. For greenhouse gases, everybody's waiting. I know, I'm sorry. We had hoped that we were going to have the information out. And just so that you're prepared, what we've got coming is 2019 data. So we still don't yet have 2020 data to be working with. Energy Information Administration is just releasing 2019 data as well. The US EPA, who provides the state inventory tool that we use as the backbone of our analysis, is going to be providing an updated data set. We've been told February 21st. And so as soon as we've got that, we're ready to plug the numbers in and see what we get for our estimates of emissions that occurred in 2019 of greenhouse gases. And we will be projecting out across future years. We do have completed, thanks to the University of Maine, our estimates of carbon sequestration. So if we go to the next slide, what you're seeing here shows the essentially what you're going to largely see when we release the greenhouse gas inventory is an estimate of gross greenhouse gas emissions, an estimate of sequestered carbon, and then the calculated estimate of net greenhouse gas emissions. So just as a reminder, when the legislation passed creating the Climate Council, we also clarified how we measure greenhouse gases in the state. And so now we measure gross greenhouse gas emissions, and that's our 45% and 80% emission reduction goals are associated with gross emissions. Those include emissions from biogenic sources, including things like wood combustion. So historically, the way that we've provided that information in the biennial greenhouse gas inventories has varied. Now, as a result of the statute and the rule that DEP has in place, this will be consistent moving forward. And so it's important then to also have that sequestration value that's shown as the green line underneath. And I'm not going to be able to articulately explain how these calculations are done, but Ivan is here, Dr. Fernandez, and I know he can handle that if someone wants to get into the weeds. But essentially, when we look at gross emissions minus the amount of carbon that's been sequestered, that enables us to give credit to the benefit of our natural resources to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And this is one of the things that is come to the forefront in LD 1429. That is the bill to now establish the net zero goal in statute to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, which was called for by governor's executive order, and this council has already been planning for. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially we are projecting our gross greenhouse gas emissions will go down, that a proper management of our natural resources is important to maximize how much carbon we are sequestering. And as a result, we're able to show that our overall impact to the atmosphere is being mitigated by proper management as well as emission reduction goals. And let's see, I think that's it. Oh, is there one more? Next slide. Oh, okay. All right. So with that, any questions for Pat or I?
Commissioner Loisem, just a reminder to the Climate Council that as DEP finishes that biannual emissions report, which is kind of the ultimate report card of our work, even though it only goes through 2019, which is prior to the climate plan, we do plan to do a special briefing for the Climate Council probably in late March if everything is done, just so that you have that heads up prior. We don't have another meeting until May, so we just wanted to make sure you're all in the loop. So that will be a special meeting, optional, but obviously lots of folks on this Zoom screen who do care about what those numbers mean.
I'll jump in, Hannah.
Okay.
This may go, hey, Commissioner, this may go to both of you, but Commissioner Kelleher, you and I and many, many other partners have a long history of working together to secure significant federal funds for the state. And I know across the administration, there's lots and lots of conversations about that. Is there anything that you and your team imagine the NGO community focusing on or helping specifically with? You know, we have such a long standing partnership, and I know we've got a lot to build upon, and I also know that you're all under a lot of stress. So just want to get it out there how the rest of the world can be helpful.
Not under any stress. I have to do, besides having to go get physical therapy every morning just so I can stand up straight. There's no stress in my life. So thanks, Kate. I appreciate that question. I think, you know, I think back to the work that we have done, the work on the Penobscot, work on the tributaries to the Penobscot, some of the work that has happened over the years in Eastern Maine through Project Share in particular. Those are all examples that we need to carry forward as we're prioritizing infrastructure dollars. And, you know, the Kennebec is the next great river that we need to deal with. It has tremendous challenges, regulatory challenges that it's going to be facing. I think we have an opportunity here to leverage infrastructure money to do some things that wouldn't be possible through the regular FERC process. And if only we had a willing partner on the Kennebec River, as far as the company is concerned, we continue to want to see business as usual there. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the federal agencies are going to be looking at those things as well. But I think the partnership with the NGOs, with the state agencies, with NOAA Fisheries in particular, I think give us an opportunity to really make some big changes, whether it's the Kennebec or, you know, across the region. So it's really an exciting time, but I think the priority work that TNC has started is going to be critical to laying out what the roadmap is going to look like.
Thanks, Pat, for the partnership.
Great. Any other hard questions for Commissioner Loisem or especially Commissioner Kelleher? Complaining about his bad back, but he can answer some hard questions. Well, I will say, I just want to thank them both. I mean, I think that this Climate Council meeting has been a lot of information sort of at you and updates on where we are, but I certainly think that both of those two departments are doing a lot of heavy lifting on climate. I think they take very seriously the recommendations of the Climate Council, and they have, you know, really dedicated staff who are now doing the work of implementing. And that is, I think, should be exciting to the Climate Council, that our plan is being really taken seriously. It's being thought about specifically in communities, on working waterfronts, among state science teams, and it's having an impact. So again, you know, huge thank you to those two departments, among many others who are doing the work of implementing. So on that, Cassie, you want to just gonna wrap it up with a little bit of an overview of some of the other things. And I think that Commissioner Kelleher and Commissioner Loisem really started to speak to that. As a state government, we are still in process thinking about opportunities that have been given for climate implementation that came from previous and recent state budgets, like the Land for Maine's Future funding that Commissioner Kelleher just spoke about. The American Rescue Plan through the Maine Jobs and Recovery Plan has offered state agencies and quasi-state agencies opportunities on things like energy efficiency, adaptation, housing, highly efficient housing opportunities. So we are doing a lot of heavy lifting right now to start to figure out how to get those funds out to communities and make projects happen. So that work is happening. And now we have the new opportunity, which I think Kate just really talked about, and that is the federal infrastructure bill, which is tremendous. It has hundreds of lines of opportunity for state government, for universities, for NGOs, for communities. And most of those, I think most, if not all of those programs have not yet been released. So our current efforts are to try to organize ourselves as a state to think about partnerships across state government and again in communities to make sure that Maine is ready for those funds. There are both funds that will come specifically to the state as a formula. Right now, Dan Burgess is not on this call, the director of the governor's energy office, because he's in DC for a meeting of his national association. Lots of discussion with the Department of Energy about lots of energy funds coming to the state of Maine, when those will come, what the opportunities will look like for states, how we prepare for them, but lots of other lines and programs. And I think in our next Climate Council meeting, we might get into those in more detail. We're really waiting for most of the actual release of funds and the rules of the programs and rules of competitive funds to come out. But just for your overview, it doesn't cover every area of climate action, but significant support on the energy and building side, specifically EV charging funds, as well as funds for electric school buses and ferries. There's port infrastructure money, as well as rail infrastructure money, money for bicycle and pedestrian improvements, public transportation, electrification of public transportation, complete streets programs, obviously lots of other transportation infrastructure money, and DOT is working really hard and traditionally has been very competitive for federal funds. So we're excited about a variety of opportunities. A lot of those transportation infrastructure funds come with more focus on resilience and impacts of climate. So in addition, there are other, I think Pat spoke about these, but coastal and wildlife restorations, culverts money, wildlife connectivity money, agriculture programs, significant funding for drinking water and wastewater programs. And we see that as an opportunity for, you know, lots of the infrastructure we have that is especially climate vulnerable. Again, we have funds, additional funds that have come from previous federal bills that the state is investing, and now this is really a pretty transformational opportunity that Melanie and the DEP staff, as well as the Health and Human Services staff, will be distributing funds, and really even just the challenge of how to get those funds out and spend them wisely is a heavy lift over the next couple of years, but obviously a huge opportunity for Maine. We see significant broadband funds to the state of Maine. We already have about $150 million that have come from the previous American Rescue Plan and now more funds in this infrastructure bill. I think probably many of you heard about the legislature and Governor Mills proposed and now have funded the Maine Connectivity Authority, which is a new body that will seek to deploy these funds more aggressively. And the climate plan has a focus on broadband. It's about, obviously there are equity issues and reduction of vehicle miles traveled associated with access to quality high-speed internet. It's also important for our energy system. So broadband opportunity is helpful for climate. And last but not least, we're certainly seeing a focus from the new federal funding around equity, the White House Justice 40 initiative, lots of focus on equity. And there are different definitions that they use. There are significant tribal funds available. There's some targeted rural funding. So I will just say we'll continue to provide more detailed updates as we have them, but we are just now at the initial stages of some excitement, some trepidation about how does the state compete. I think Governor Mills feels very strongly that we want Maine to be as competitive as possible. We don't want to leave opportunities on the table, and we certainly see this as a way in which to fund activities of the climate plan that might have not been possible without these kind of, I would say, almost say transformational funds for certain kinds of climate activities. So more on that, but just wanted to give folks kind of the quick overview that we are wrapping our minds around it, but we are not wasting any time in preparing. Next slide. So the other thing obviously happening right now is the Maine legislature is meeting. We have a couple of legislators on the Climate Council who are probably manning 2 Zoom screens right now because they're in committee right now, and lots of commissioners are also engaged with the legislature. This is the short session, so the legislature is only in until sometime in April when they adjourn, and they are more focused on things that have been carried over from last session and emergency measures. So it's not as much, not as many bills, but still lots happening. The governor will give her state of the state this coming tomorrow night, Thursday night, and her budget, her supplemental budget will come soon thereafter. So some opportunities for some additional climate progress, but obviously lots of us are doing the heavy lifting of spending the investments that have been currently made in a lot of our activities. We do see a handful of bills that overlap with the climate plan, and I won't go through the details. Commissioner Loisem has mentioned a couple of them. Certainly natural working lands, there was a mention of the carbon neutrality bill, which passed out of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee just a week or so ago. Other efforts around ecological reserves, solar and agricultural siting. Obviously a task force just finished up their report, and there's discussions about how to move forward on that. We talked about sea level rise. There's a number of different activities specifically around housing, land use, and zoning, how to both meet affordable housing outcomes, but also ensure denser housing development so that people can live and work in their communities, can drive less, as well as meet obviously the huge lack of housing that we have for people who want to live and work in Maine. That overlaps with municipal planning discussions happening in a couple of different committees about how do we support communities as they consider the challenges and the opportunities with land use. Certainly lots of climate overlaps. Specifically, there's a bill around the Climate Corps and climate education. Both have been recommended for funding and moving forward. Discussion of labor provisions for energy projects, forest tax incentives. The Energy and Utilities Committee is always extremely busy, still a lot on their plate this legislative session. Again, Dan Burgess isn't here to give you the highlights, but lots of discussion about our utilities and how to ensure that they are accountable to ratepayers, that they are doing what we need them to do to be able to decarbonize our state and obviously meet additional energy needs going forward. So a number of different bills in that committee that I think will be a major focus of this legislative session. Our office has been specifically working with the Maine legislature around a number of definitions around environmental justice. Those are coming to the Environment and Natural Resources Committee later this month. And again, as I mentioned, the governor's supplemental budget coming, which the state's revenue picture has continued to be positive. So that is helpful for needed investment in a variety of environmental challenges. Luckily, PFAS is not the problem of the Maine Climate Council. it's Commissioner Loisem and Commissioner Beal and others challenge to deal with, but lots of focus this legislative session on those issues. So we'll provide you an update at our next meeting about sort of what happened and what it means for the specific goals and the strategies of the Maine Climate Council. I would say a lot of the heavy lifting right now really is in implementation, but many of these efforts in the Maine legislature continue to overlap, and hopefully the outcomes will be helpful to our work. Next slide. So just a couple of reminders, really. This is just the PR session we announced at our December meeting, our new website, mainewon'twait.org. We continue to put new stories up. We always would love to hear ideas from Climate Council members as well as communities and businesses about things that are happening around the state of Maine in climate. This website obviously is more about what businesses, communities, consumers, people can do, and we've gotten some great traction. So just appreciate everyone's efforts in continuing to share that. Specifically in the next month or so, we're focusing on clean energy careers and youth climate action. So really excited. Obviously there's tremendous youth and college campus interest in climate action. So we are just excited to continue to highlight those climate leaders in our state who are doing really good work. And last but not least, our next meeting is May 12th, and we continue to look at public health guidelines and where things are. It's hard to fully understand where we're going, but we continue to weigh the possibility of a climate leadership summit May 12th, which would overlap with the Climate Council meeting. So we will keep you posted. It may make more sense to do some hybrid online activities and some in person, but we're going to try to make that decision sometime early next month. So we will keep everyone posted. It was nice to see some people in real life in December, and so we are debating whether or not it makes sense to do that again. Conferences are a lot of work, but again, I think there's a lot of interest and engagement. I will say, next slide. We are very focused on communities. We launched, obviously, in December, the Community Resilience Partnership. We've gotten a ton of activity. Sarah and Brian in our GoPIF office are just fielding lots of interest from partners in helping us do this work. We have 2 different programs to provide support to organizations to work with communities. And then specifically, communities have until May 22nd to apply for the first round of grants. Specifically, another deadline coming up February 15th for grant applications for service providers to help communities. So if you are working with a community or in a community, again, or all of our Climate Council members certainly live in towns in Maine, we are really excited to get as many towns as possible thinking about climate resilience, how to reduce their emissions, plan for climate change. Again, we are offering dollars to help towns do this work. So again, a lot of good energy moving in this direction, and just encourage you all to think about ways to help us spread the word on that. Again, it's been very positively received so far. Last slide. So with that, I just want to thank you all. Just remind you again, our next meeting is May 12th. We have a plan to meet in Augusta. The conference would be at the Augusta Civic Center if it moves forward. So we'll keep you posted on that. This is our schedule of meetings for the rest of the year. And again, do look for the equity subcommittee briefing coming up, as well as the report on the DEP biannual emissions. Those will both be sort of interim meetings online that we'd love to have your participation at. So with that, it is 11 o'clock. Thank you all for your attention. Huge thanks to our presenters and staff who threw all that information at you. Again, all of us as Climate Council members, committee co-chairs and staff, as well as Melanie and I, are happy to field any questions and comments in the interim. So thank you all for being here today. And with that, unless there's any other questions or comments, I think this Maine Climate Council meeting is adjourned.